The photograph was almost ordinary at first glance, sepia-toned and frayed at the edges, a typical family portrait of the late 19th century. The small town outside the city had long been forgotten, the house itself abandoned for decades, yet the image felt heavy, as if it carried more than the faces it displayed. The family stood stiffly in front of the forest that bordered their land, their expressions formal, the faintest traces of a smile haunting only the corners of their lips. But there was something beneath the veneer of normality, a detail so subtle it might have been dismissed by anyone but the most careful observer. When the photo was magnified, a shadow emerged from the trees, a figure half hidden, half seen, its form indistinct but unmistakably human. It seemed to crouch just beyond the tree line, staring through the lens with an intensity that made the air in the room grow heavier, colder. At first, the mind searched for reason, a trick of the grainy image, a shadow of a branch, a smudge on the glass. But the figure's presence was deliberate, purposeful, as though it had been waiting for someone to notice. For hours, the descendant could not look away, each glance revealing more of the silhouette's unnerving posture, the way its eyes, or what felt like eyes, followed the family with intent. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracked windows of the attic, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter that did not belong to this century. The forest beyond the photograph seemed to breathe in tandem with the viewer's own pulse, a rhythm that hinted at secrets buried deep, secrets that had refused to remain forgotten. As the night deepened, so did the unease. The photograph was no longer just an artifact, it had become a portal to the past, a whispering reminder that the forest had seen things that could not be explained, that darkness often lingered where light had long since faded. And somewhere in that shadowed wood, the figure waited still, patient and unblinking, as if the very trees themselves were holding their breath. The discovery of the photograph began as an unremarkable Saturday in the attic, a place thick with dust and the faint scent of aged wood and mothballs. Sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating stacks of boxes, yellowed newspapers, and remnants of lives long past. Amid the clutter, the descendant's hand brushed against a worn leather-bound chest, its surface scratched and dulled by decades of neglect. Curiosity pushed them to lift the lid, and inside lay a tangle of old letters, brittle books, and finally, a carefully wrapped piece of cloth that, when unfolded, revealed the photograph. At first, it seemed like just another relic of a forgotten era, a family portrait of people whose names were barely remembered, their faces frozen in time, formal and composed, standing in front of a forest whose trees seemed dark and endless even in the frozen moment of the image. The edges of the photograph were frayed, corners curling slightly, and faint water stains marred the surface in places, hints of the many years it had endured in silence. The figures in the photograph were arranged with deliberate symmetry, a stern patriarch in the center, flanked by women and children whose expressions were carefully restrained, their eyes staring at the camera with a rigidity that spoke of social expectation rather than warmth. Yet despite the formality, there was something compelling about the scene, a subtle tension that hinted at stories unsaid, memories left unspoken. The forest behind them stretched into shadow, its depths unintelligible but suggestive of secrets hidden beneath its canopy. The descendant felt a shiver of recognition, though they had never seen these ancestors in life, a sense that this image was more than a record of a family's past, it was a window into something lingering, something that refused to be forgotten. They carefully examined the photograph, noticing the small details, the posture of a child clutching a doll, the way a hand rested against a shoulder, the way shadows fell across the ground, creating shapes that seemed almost alive. Each glance brought with it a creeping curiosity, a desire to understand why this image had survived, why it had been preserved amidst so many other forgotten items in the attic. The photograph, initially overlooked among the clutter of history, began to assert itself as an artifact of importance, not merely for its depiction of long-dead relatives, but for the unnerving feeling it evoked. Holding it, tracing the faded outlines with their fingers, the descendant sensed that the past was pressing through, faintly but insistently, as though the photograph itself were a messenger, carrying with it a secret that had waited patiently for someone to notice, a detail so subtle that it could almost go unseen, yet it radiated a presence that demanded attention. The moment the photograph was examined more closely, something extraordinary and unsettling revealed itself. At first, the descendant had assumed the image was simply an old family portrait, a frozen memory of people long gone, posed in the familiar stiffness of the 1890s. The edges of the photograph were brittle, and the colors had faded into the soft, lifeless sepia of time, but nothing in the image initially suggested anything out of the ordinary. Yet when the image was magnified, when each detail was scrutinized under the careful eye of curiosity and caution, a shadow appeared that had gone unnoticed in casual observation. At the far edge of the forest, almost blending into the dense tangle of trees and undergrowth, there was a figure. Its form was ambiguous, neither clearly defined nor entirely formless, but unmistakably human in shape, crouched or lurking as though hiding from the world. The shadow seemed to fix its gaze on the family, or perhaps on the camera itself, and though the eyes were no more than tiny specks in the grain of the photograph, they conveyed an intensity, a deliberate awareness, that made the viewer's heart tighten. For several moments, the descendant refused to believe it, pressing their eye closer, adjusting the lighting, trying to convince themselves that it was a trick of the shadows, a defect in the photograph, a crease in the paper, or the way light hit the image. But the more they looked, the more undeniable the presence became. There was an unmistakable stillness to the figure, a quiet but pressing sense that it had been intentionally positioned there, or that it had chosen to be there, aware of being watched even as it watched. It was not simply lurking, it seemed to be waiting. The forest behind the family in the photograph was dense and foreboding, darkened at its base by shadow, yet this particular figure stood out precisely because it should not have been noticed at all. Its very subtlety amplified the horror. It was almost invisible until it was seen, a reminder of how easily danger could hide in plain sight, unnoticed yet profoundly present. The realization struck the descendant with a chill. This was no ordinary family portrait. The figure's inclusion in the photograph, whether deliberate or accidental, implied something far darker than anyone in the image could have known at the time. And as the hours passed in that quiet attic, the sense of unease grew heavier, an oppressive weight pressing from the photograph itself, as though the shadowy figure had not only been captured in the past but was somehow still aware, still waiting for eyes to meet its own. Each examination, each magnified view, revealed more of its posture, the tilt of its head, the stillness of its body, deepening the realization that whatever had been captured on that fragile, aged paper was not merely a trick of the camera, but a silent, persistent presence, observing and patient, waiting for its story to be uncovered. The discovery of the shadowy figure in the photograph ignited a compulsion in the descendant that could not be ignored. What had begun as a casual fascination with an old family artifact soon transformed into a relentless need to uncover the history behind the image and the people within it. They began by tracing the family tree, poring over dusty records, ledgers, and census documents, each name a thread connecting generations. The ancestors in the photograph were no longer just faces in sepia, they became real people with lives, routines, and secrets that seemed to whisper across the decades. Diaries and journals were unearthed in forgotten drawers and boxes, written in spidery handwriting that trembled with emotion and urgency. These writings, often fragmented and difficult to decipher, hinted at lives marked by ordinary joys and profound unease, moments of domestic tranquility interrupted by incidents that defied explanation. The descendant discovered repeated references to the forest, the same one that appeared behind the family in the photograph, described in vague, anxious terms. There were mentions of strange sounds at night, footprints that appeared and disappeared, and glimpses of figures at the edge of the property, always watching, always just beyond reach. Local newspapers from the late 1800s, painstakingly scanned page by page, revealed accounts of disappearances, rumors of children vanishing without a trace, and unexplained disturbances in the woods. At first, these reports seemed disconnected, isolated incidents, but as the descendant pieced them together, a pattern began to emerge. The forest was more than a backdrop, it was a stage on which repeated, inexplicable events unfolded. Letters exchanged between family members added a further layer of unease. They spoke of visitors who arrived unannounced, of conversations abruptly ending, of strange carvings in trees that nobody could explain. Some passages, heavily smudged or torn, conveyed fear so palpable that the descendant felt it as though the words themselves trembled on the page. Each discovery reinforced the unsettling possibility that the shadow in the photograph was not an incidental anomaly, but part of a continuum of events tied to the family's history. The deeper the descendant delved, the more they felt the weight of generations pressing upon them, as if the forest itself had been watching, recording, and waiting. The photograph, once a simple curiosity, now stood as a portal to a narrative that transcended time, linking the past to the present through the persistent, enigmatic presence hidden in the trees. The urge to understand the truth grew irresistible, compelling the descendant to continue tracing every lead, every scrap of evidence, no matter how obscure, until the hidden story of the family and the forest began to take shape with a clarity that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. As the descendant delved deeper into the history surrounding the photograph, it became increasingly clear that the forest behind the family was far more than a mere backdrop, it was a place steeped in legend and whispered fear. Locals who still remembered the old family estate, or whose families had lived in the vicinity for generations, spoke of the forest with a mixture of reverence and dread. Even in casual conversation, their voices would drop to a hushed tone, as though the very mention of the trees could summon unseen eyes. Tales of children vanishing without a trace were common, stories handed down from parent to child, each retelling adding subtle flourishes that blurred the line between fact and folklore. They spoke of families avoiding the woods after sunset, of farmers hearing strange footsteps and whispers along the edges of their property, and of travelers who claimed to see figures moving between the trunks, disappearing when approached. Some described lights flickering deep in the forest at odd hours, glowing faintly through the fog like ghostly lanterns, never explained, never followed. The descendant found these stories both fascinating and alarming, for they seemed to echo the subtle, deliberate presence captured in the photograph. The forest itself appeared to exert a kind of magnetic pull, drawing attention to its dense shadows and hidden corners, while simultaneously warning outsiders to stay away. Occasionally, older residents would recall objects left at the edge of the woods, small toys, abandoned dolls, trinkets whose origins were never known, as if the forest collected them silently, marking the passage of those who entered and never returned. There were even accounts of strange marks etched into tree bark, symbols that had no discernible meaning but that gave the impression of a language or code belonging to some unseen intelligence. As the descendant compiled these accounts, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. The forest had a reputation that spanned decades, perhaps centuries, and the warnings were not merely superstition. There was a pervasive sense that the woods were sentient in some inexplicable way, observing, waiting, shaping the fears and memories of those who dared to approach. This revelation transformed the photograph into something far more ominous than a mere family portrait. It was evidence of a long-standing, almost ritualistic presence that had haunted the land for generations. Every anecdote and recollection of strange occurrences lent weight to the possibility that the figure lurking in the trees was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a much larger, enduring mystery. The descendant could feel the forest presence even from the pages of old accounts, the collective unease of those who had lived near it pressing in with every new story, suggesting that the secret hidden among the trees was far older, far deeper, and far more dangerous than any ordinary observer could comprehend. The more they listened, the more the forest itself seemed to come alive, a living entity holding its secrets close while hinting that the past had never truly let go. The discovery of letters and correspondence hidden among the family's old belongings added a chilling layer of depth to the story of the photograph and the forest beyond it. Carefully preserved in a faded envelope, tied with a brittle ribbon, the letters were addressed to various family members across generations, written in looping, elegant script that had begun to fade with the passage of time. At first glance, the messages seemed innocuous, greetings, well wishes, updates on mundane daily life, but as the descendant read further, the true nature of their content emerged. One letter described a visit from a man who arrived unannounced at the family estate, his presence inexplicable and unsettling. The writer noted an immediate unease, a tension in the air that refused to dissipate even after pleasantries were exchanged. Another letter spoke of noises in the night, footsteps circling the house, doors opening and closing on their own, whispers that seemed to come from the forest outside the windows. The descriptions were brief yet vivid, enough to make the descendant shiver, imagining the terror of hearing something unidentifiable lurking beyond the threshold of safety. Some correspondences hinted at an unspoken agreement within the family, a collective recognition of the forest as something dangerous yet significant, almost sacred in its malevolence. There were accounts of strange markings appearing at the edge of the woods, carved into trees or scratched into the soil, patterns that the writers did not understand but feared. The letters suggested that these phenomena were not one-off occurrences but repeated events, a cycle of eerie happenings that persisted over decades. Occasionally, references were made to an unnamed figure glimpsed in the shadows, the same subtle presence that the descendant had noticed in the photograph, described as watching from the tree-line, never approaching, never retreating, always just beyond reach. The weight of the letters was amplified by the personal tone. These were not public reports or sensationalized stories, but intimate confessions filled with fear, confusion, and a desperate need to document the inexplicable. As the descendant read, they began to feel the same tension, the same oppressive awareness that had gripped the original writers, as though the emotions contained within the ink had seeped across time. The forest, once an abstract backdrop, became a living entity through these accounts, a place capable of observation and influence, shaping the lives of those who lived in its shadow. Each letter added a new thread to the tapestry of mystery, reinforcing the idea that the shadowy figure in the photograph was part of a continuum, not a random anomaly. The descendant realized that these correspondences were more than historical artifacts, they were warnings, records of encounters with something that defied explanation, a persistent presence that had intertwined itself with the family's fate and now, perhaps, with their own. After immersing themselves in the letters, journals, and local legends, the descendant began to experience phenomena that could not be explained by reason or memory alone. At first, it was subtle, small, almost dismissible occurrences that could be written off as coincidence. Objects would shift slightly when they were not looking, or the faintest brush of movement would catch their eye in the corner of a room. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching and twisting in ways that defied natural light. But soon, the experiences grew more vivid and insistent. Night brought with it dreams that felt more like memories than imagination, visions of the family in the photograph standing in the forest, the shadowy figure at the tree-line always just visible, watching, waiting. The dreams were disorienting, almost cinematic in their detail, capturing the damp scent of moss, the brittle rustle of fallen leaves, the tension of figures frozen in mid-motion. Each morning, the descendant would wake with the impression that the dreams had not ended, that some part of the forest had followed them into the waking world. Occasionally, fleeting glimpses of figures appeared in reflective surfaces, a silhouette passing behind a window when no one was outside, or a shifting shape in the hallway mirror that vanished when approached. These apparitions were never aggressive, yet their presence was oppressive, heavy with expectation, and imbued with the same sense of deliberate attention as the figure in the photograph. The descendants' awareness of these phenomena expanded beyond vision alone. The air in the rooms where they spent the most time felt different, colder, charged with an intangible electricity. Sounds arrived unexpectedly, whispers too faint to comprehend, the distant crunch of leaves under invisible feet, the rustle of fabric where no one could be. It became clear that the boundary between the past and the present, between the photograph and reality, was thinning. As unsettling as the visions were, they seemed purposeful, almost communicative, guiding the descendants' attention toward forgotten corners, urging them to revisit documents, letters, and maps, and to examine the photograph once more. There was a rhythm to it, an underlying logic that suggested the shadowy presence had a plan, that the events of the past were not entirely contained by time, but had the capacity to reach across decades. With each night, the dreams deepened, layering memories with premonitions, and the line between what had been recorded in family history and what was happening now became increasingly blurred. The descendant began to question their own senses, their own grip on reality, but despite the fear, there was an irresistible pull to continue, a need to understand why the figure had chosen to reveal itself now, and what its ongoing presence demanded, drawing them ever closer to the truth that had remained hidden for generations. When the descendant finally made the journey to the old family property, the air itself seemed charged with expectation, heavy with the weight of years and secrets that refused to stay buried. The house, long abandoned, sagged under its own history, windows clouded with grime, doors hanging slightly ajar as if inviting, or warning, the visitor. Outside, the forest stretched immediately from the edge of the property, its darkened canopy dense and unwelcoming, the trees standing like silent sentinels. As they stepped onto the grounds, the descendant felt a tremor of recognition, an uncanny sense that the land itself remembered their ancestors, remembered the moments captured in the photograph, and that it was now observing them with the same intensity that the shadowy figure had once exhibited. Moving cautiously, they traced familiar landmarks mentioned in letters and diaries, noticing subtle changes, paths overgrown, hedges twisted, stones dislodged, but also uncanny consistencies, a broken gate, the curve of the driveway, the hollow of a tree stump, all frozen echoes of the past. Soon, physical evidence emerged, confirming the chilling hints they had encountered in records and stories. Faded footprints, partially erased by time and weather yet discernible upon close inspection, led toward the forest's edge. Occasionally, broken objects lay half-buried in the undergrowth, a child's wooden toy, weathered and cracked, as if left decades ago and never retrieved, fragments of a journal, pages stiff and yellowed, scattered beneath tangled roots. Each artifact was a fragment of a larger puzzle, tangible proof that the forest had long been a place where human presence and some inexplicable force intersected. The descendant noticed strange markings etched into the bark of trees, deep grooves arranged in patterns that felt intentional but whose meaning eluded comprehension. The more they explored, the more the environment seemed alive, almost responsive. Branches shifted as if brushing against invisible hands, leaves whispered in rhythms that mirrored the murmurs described in letters, and the distant cries of birds or other animals carried an eerie undertone of caution, or perhaps warning. A cold draft would sweep across open clearings with no discernible source, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, forming shapes that suggested movement, awareness, or even intent. Each step into the forest heightened the sensation that the descendant was not merely observing history but walking within it, brushing against echoes of events that had transpired decades prior, and potentially awakening a presence that had remained patient and vigilant. It was not simply a visit to ancestral land, it was an encounter with the lingering residue of a past that refused to remain static, a physical manifestation of the mysteries hinted at in letters and journals, and the palpable confirmation that the forest had been more than scenery in the photograph. It had been a stage for something enduring, deliberate, and profoundly unsettling. Every discovery, every artifact, every subtle shift in the environment reinforced the notion that the forest was both guardian and witness, and that the descendants' arrival was no coincidence. As the descendant delved deeper into the forest and examined every artifact, every scrap of correspondence, and every whisper of local lore, a chilling pattern began to emerge, a hidden connection linking the shadowy figure in the photograph to the family itself. At first, it was subtle, similarities between the figure's posture and the angles captured in old photographs, the repeated references in letters to watching or presence near the forest edge, and the consistent locations of abandoned objects that aligned with places shown in images from decades past. These were coincidences that, taken alone, could have been dismissed, yet together they formed an unnerving web, as though the figure was not a stranger at all but somehow intertwined with the lives of the family members, present across generations without ever being named. The journals hinted at secrets deliberately obscured, accounts of visitors who never fully entered the house but seemed to observe from a distance, notes about family members who experienced visions or dreams mirroring the shadowy presence, and subtle warnings to maintain certain boundaries with the forest. The descendant began to sense that the figure was tied not just to the land but to the family lineage itself, perhaps even as a guardian, a witness, or something far more sinister. Stories of disappearances, peculiar illnesses, and sudden, inexplicable behaviors within the family began to make sense in a new, terrifying light. It was as though the shadowy presence had always been there, shaping events, influencing decisions, and marking moments that might otherwise have been forgotten. A closer examination of old letters revealed repeated references to a watcher, sometimes sketched as a vague silhouette in the margins, sometimes only hinted at in cryptic phrases like, "It waits, patient as always," or, "Do not follow its eyes." These messages were not addressed to strangers but to family members themselves, passed down with an urgency that suggested a shared understanding of the figure's importance. The descendant began to realize that the photograph was not a simple record of a family gathering, but evidence of a long-standing relationship, a history in which the line between observer and observed was blurred. Each artifact in the forest, each hidden marking in the trees, and each fragment of writing now seemed deliberately placed, part of a trail left for someone to discover generations later. The figure was more than a ghost or an intruder, it was part of the family's legacy, an enduring presence that had somehow threaded itself through time, demanding recognition. The realization brought both fear and fascination, for it suggested that the events of the past were not entirely closed, that the forest's secrets were intimately connected to the bloodline and that the descendant had become, knowingly or not, a participant in the continuation of a story that had begun over a century ago, a story that had been patiently waiting for the right eyes to uncover it. As the evidence and experiences coalesced into an undeniable truth, the descendant felt an irresistible pull to confront the unknown directly. The forest, once merely a backdrop to old photographs and family stories, now loomed as a living entity, dense and suffocating, its shadows thick with anticipation. Each step onto the leaf-strewn path sent a shiver up their spine, as if the ground itself recognized the intrusion and whispered warnings with every rustle. The sunlight filtering through the canopy was fragmented, slanting in unpredictable angles that cast distorted shapes across the forest floor, shapes that occasionally resembled human figures moving just beyond perception. The deeper they ventured, the more the presence of the shadowy figure from the photograph seemed to manifest in the environment itself. Every branch, every tree trunk, every sudden movement in the corner of their vision carried with it a sense of intent, as though the forest was aware, watching, responding. Occasionally, there were fleeting glimpses of shapes that dissolved when approached, the vague outline of a crouching figure that matched the stance seen in the photograph, disappearing into the undergrowth before the mind could fully process what it had seen. A cold wind would brush across their neck at unexpected moments, carrying with it whispers so faint they could barely be heard, yet they resonated deep within, familiar, almost like echoes of ancestral warnings. The descendant's senses became hyper-aware, each sound amplified, the crack of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, that all seemed to be part of an intricate rhythm, a subtle communication from the forest or from the presence that had haunted it for generations. As they navigated deeper into the trees, the forest itself seemed to guide them toward locations that mirrored those depicted in the photograph, as if retracing the steps of the family long ago. There was an overwhelming sense that this journey was not accidental, that the figure had been waiting for someone to arrive, and now the descendant had crossed the threshold into a domain where past and present collided. Each clearing and shadowed nook revealed fragments of history, remnants of objects left decades ago, impressions of footprints, and traces of the rituals that might have been performed in secrecy, all pointing to an enduring link between the family and the forest. The air grew heavier, charged with anticipation, and the feeling of being observed intensified, pressing against the mind with a weight that was both terrifying and magnetic. The forest was no longer passive, it was active, alive, and inextricably tied to the shadowy presence that had watched from the photograph. The descendant felt the boundary between observer and participant dissolve, recognizing that to confront the unknown was to step fully into the ongoing narrative, to become entwined with the figure's enduring vigilance and the mysteries that had persisted unseen for over a century, and to face the truths that the forest had guarded patiently across generations. After days of tracing the forest paths, examining every artifact, and piecing together the fragmented family history, the descendant finally arrived at a place where the forest seemed to open up, revealing its secret as though it had been waiting for this precise moment. In a small clearing, overgrown but unmistakably tended at some point in the past, lay remnants that tied together generations of mystery, a weathered stone marker, partially covered in moss, with carved symbols that matched the strange etchings found in letters and on tree bark, a circle of scattered objects, broken toys, fragments of old journals, personal items, that seemed to mark a deliberate pattern, and the faint impressions of footsteps that suggested movement both recent and ancient. Standing there, the descendant felt a presence unlike any other encountered before, a quiet intensity that was palpable in the very air, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, in the shifting shadows at the edge of the clearing, the figure appeared, no longer merely a subtle outline in a photograph, but a tangible presence, still ambiguous in form yet unmistakably aware, watching, and waiting. The realization struck with a mixture of horror and awe. This figure, the shadow that had haunted the family for over a century, was not some random anomaly, but a sentinel, a guardian, or perhaps a remnant of the very events that had shaped the family's darkest history. The descendant understood that every vision, every strange occurrence, every letter and diary entry had been building toward this moment, guiding them to confront the continuity of the past. As the figure shifted, seemingly acknowledging the descendant's presence, fragments of memory and inherited knowledge surged forward, the stories whispered by ancestors, the warnings encoded in letters, the fears etched in the forest's every corner, connecting in a web that spanned generations. There was no malice in the figure, yet its presence conveyed a weight of expectation, a reminder that the family's legacy was inseparable from the forest and the mysteries it contained. The descendant's pulse quickened as the truth unfolded. The forest's horrors were not random, the shadowy figure was not a stranger, and the photograph had been more than a mere image, it was a record, a warning, a key. Everything aligned, the disappearances, the dreams, the hidden artifacts, the whispered warnings, all pointing to the same conclusion that the past had never truly ended. It lingered, persistent and patient, shaping the present just as it had shaped generations before. Standing in the clearing, with the figure at the forest's edge, the descendant felt the enormity of the revelation, the intertwining of family, place, and unseen forces, the delicate balance between observer and participant, and the understanding that this confrontation was not a finale but a culmination of centuries of watchful presence. The forest had finally revealed its secret, and in doing so, it demanded acknowledgement, a recognition that the past, though hidden, had never truly released its hold, and that the shadowy figure, silent and eternal, would continue to watch as long as someone remembered.